What happens when music becomes protest and film becomes revolution? The 1970s birthed more than just rock. It gave rise to a cinema movement that screamed against conformity. These weren't just musicals. They were rock operas that tore through politics, religion, and societal norms. Stick around as we explore 13 explosive films that amplified counterculture like never before. Tommy. Directed by Ken Russell and based on The Who's landmark album, Tommy wasn't just a rock opera. It was an acid-fueled trip through the psychic wreckage of a broken generation. The story centers around a boy rendered deaf, dumb, and blind by trauma who rises to become a messianic pinball champion, only to face the pitfalls of blind worship. With Roger Daltrey in the lead, the film blends surreal imagery with gospel, glam, and psych rock madness. But Tommy is more than a bizarre musical spectacle. It's a savage satire of religious exploitation, pop idol worship, and the hollowness of fame. Ken Russell doesn't hold back, turning Anne Margaret into a mother writhing in beans and chocolate, and Jack Nicholson into a rock-singing doctor. This was a visual war against respectability and tradition. Released at the height of post-60s disillusionment, Tommy became a beacon for kids lost in a world that felt fake and overly sanitized. It didn't just speak to rebels, it crowned them. The soundtrack soared, the visuals shocked, and the message was clear. Your trauma is real, but salvation through conformity is a lie. Tommy wasn't merely a film, it was a counterculture sermon in guitar feedback. Jesus Christ Superstar. When Andrew Lloyd Webber's Jesus Christ Superstar hit the screen, it did more than tell the passion of Christ. It turned it into a psychedelic protest. Directed by Norman Jewison and filmed in the deserts of Israel, the film depicts Jesus as a weary revolutionary, Judas as a conflicted activist, and the apostles as 70s radicals searching for a cause. With its powerful fusion of gospel, rock, and funk, this wasn't your Sunday school story. The movie boldly critiques organized religion and the commodification of belief. The casting of a black Judas, played with volcanic emotion by Carl Anderson, challenged not just biblical narratives, but America's racial status quo. The film's aesthetic, full of bell-bottoms, afros, and military uniforms, connected the ancient tale to contemporary revolutions. Judas questions whether Jesus is just a man or a media creation, a chilling echo of how movements often devour their leaders. Webber's electric guitar riffs howl as the establishment prepares for execution, and when Jesus finally asks, "Why should I die?" it hits like a generational cry. Jesus Christ Superstar doesn't preach, it protests. And in doing so, it turns the sacred into a battleground, where faith, fame, and rebellion collide under a disco-lit cross. Phantom of the Paradise. Brian De Palma's Phantom of the Paradise is what happens when Faust, the Phantom of the Opera, and glam rock crash into each other at full speed. With songs by Paul Williams and a neon-lit set design, the film is a scathing critique of the music industry's exploitation of creativity and the soul-shredding hunger for fame. The story follows Winslow, a composer whose music is stolen by an evil producer named Swan. After being mutilated and imprisoned, he returns as the masked phantom to take revenge. It's a revenge fantasy drenched in eyeliner, platform shoes, and screams of betrayal. What made this film resonate with the counterculture wasn't just its camp or rock anthems, it was its anger. Phantom of the Paradise painted the music industry as a demonic machine chewing up artists for profit. Swan, played by Paul Williams himself, becomes a symbol of the system, charming, eternal, and utterly corrupt. Though the film was a commercial flop, it became a cult classic, especially in countercultural hotbeds like Winnipeg and Paris. It gave voice to disillusioned artists and fans who saw the machine behind the glitter. In a decade where art was being commercialized, Phantom of the Paradise screamed, "Don't sell your soul for stardom. It's not worth the contract in blood." The Rocky Horror Picture Show. No rock opera from the 70s pushed the boundaries of sexuality, identity, and cultural norms like the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Directed by Jim Sharman and based on Richard O'Brien's stage musical, this film was a gothic glam rock fever dream. Part Frankenstein, part Flash Gordon, and all rebellion, it's centered around a prudish couple whose car breaks down, leading them into the seductive castle of Dr. Frankenfurter, a sweet transvestite from transsexual Transylvania. The film shattered gender binaries and sexual repression in ways never before seen on screen. Tim Curry's iconic performance as Frankenfurter is still one of cinema's most electrifying displays of androgyny, charm, and madness. From the moment he descends in heels and fishnets, he doesn't just demand attention, he liberates it. The musical numbers, Time Warp, Touch Me, I'm Going Home, blasted through taboos and celebrated queerness, kink, and self-expression. It wasn't just about rebellion, it was about radical freedom of identity. While critics didn't know what to make of it at first, midnight showings turned it into a cult revolution, complete with costumes, shoutbacks, and a worldwide community of outsiders who finally felt seen. Rocky Horror didn't just challenge mainstream values, it incinerated them with glitter and eyeliner. It was a counterculture party where the freaks weren't just welcome, they were the stars. Listomania. Imagine classical music, glam rock, Nazi imagery, and giant inflatable phalluses, all mashed into one frenzied film. That's Listomania, Ken Russell's insane follow-up to Tommy. Starring The Who's Roger Daltrey as 19th century composer Franz Liszt, the film reimagines him as the world's first rock star, complete with screaming fans, merchandising hysteria, and sexual excess. Ken Russell wasn't trying to make a biopic, he was crafting a visual orgasm of cultural rebellion. Liszt becomes a metaphor for every artist chewed up by fame, sexualized by the public, and drained by corporate exploitation. The film is so unhinged, it borders on parody, yet that's what makes it brilliant. The counterculture embraced Listomania not because it was accessible, but because it wasn't. It mocked commercialism, religion, and fascism through wild imagery and absurd musical numbers. Ringo Starr shows up as the Pope. Liszt fights off vampires, and his piano becomes a rocket ship. While mainstream audiences and critics were left dazed, those tuned into its chaotic frequency saw it as a rebellious celebration of creative madness. Listomania embodied the 70s rock era, flashy, excessive, misunderstood. But defiant in its refusal to bow to logic or tradition, it wasn't about making sense. It was about making noise. Godspell. At first glance, Godspell may seem like a harmless hippie-era retelling of the Gospel according to Matthew. But beneath its playful exterior lies a film that redefined spiritual storytelling for a generation fed up with institutional dogma. Directed by David Green and shot amidst the empty streets of New York City, the film uses clown-like costumes, street theater, and folk rock music to bring parables to life. The counterculture didn't reject faith, they rejected the systems that corrupted it. Godspell offered an alternative, a joyful, humanistic Jesus who preaches through song and play, not fear and fire. The soundtrack, featuring hits like Day by Day, radiated warmth, love, and peaceful rebellion. In one of its most profound moments, the disciples are baptized not in a church, but in a city fountain, symbolizing a reclaiming of spirituality from the institutions that failed the youth. The colorful costumes, diverse cast, and inclusive messages made Godspell a quiet revolution. It said you could be joyful and still resist. For a generation watching their governments wage wars and their churches preach judgment, Godspell provided a spiritual home outside of organized religion. It was counterculture in flower crowns and face paint. Gentle, but still a protest. It taught that love could be louder than condemnation and that even the sacred could dance barefoot through the streets of Manhattan. Hair, based on the groundbreaking Broadway musical Milos Forman's Hair, is a kaleidoscopic ode to anti-war resistance, sexual liberation, and youthful rebellion. When Claude Bukowski arrives in New York City to join the Army, he meets a tribe of free-spirited hippies led by the charismatic Berger. Through psychedelic songs and wild dance numbers, Claude is pulled into a world that defies everything he's been taught. The music, Aquarius, Let the Sun Shine In, Easy to Be Hard, wasn't just background. It was the soul of the counterculture itself, optimistic, angry, ecstatic, mournful. Hair doesn't just depict rebellion, it lives it, challenging the Vietnam War, the draft, and conservative norms with every note. Foreman's adaptation added emotional weight by turning the final act into a devastating twist. Berger switches places with Claude for a short military visit, but ends up shipped to Vietnam in his place. That final graveyard scene where the hippies gather to sing Let the Sun Shine In is a gut punch. Joy turns to mourning. Peace turns to death. Hair wasn't just about rejecting war. It was about choosing life, raw, imperfect, and free. It dared to say that dancing in the park with strangers might be more righteous than following orders to kill. In the last gasp of the 70s, Hair proved that the revolution could still sing, even as it mourned its martyrs. All this and World War II. This might be the strangest entry on the list, a rock opera documentary without actors, scripts, or even a traditional plot. All this and World War II takes actual World War II newsreel footage and splices it together with Beatles covers by 70s rock stars like Elton John, Tina Turner, and Peter Gabriel. It's surreal, it's satirical, and it's loaded with anti-war subtext. The film presents Hitler rising to power as Fool on the Hill plays, while war scenes are underscored with ironic renditions of Help or Come Together. At first it feels absurd, but the more you watch, the more the collision of pop culture and global tragedy begins to resonate. It's a critique of both blind nationalism and the way history gets packaged for mass consumption. At its heart, the film suggests that even the most powerful propaganda machine can't silence the voice of rebellion, especially when it comes in the form of rock and roll. Though panned by critics, it has since been re-evaluated as an experimental political statement. It's not just about war, it's about memory, media, and the dangers of romanticizing power. All this and World War II turned the Beatles into a Greek chorus of the 20th century and reminded us that music, when reimagined, can become a mirror of madness. It's not a film you watch to be entertained, it's a film that dares you to rethink everything. The Apple. Technically released in 1980, The Apple was conceived and shot during the 70s, and it carries every ounce of that decade's flamboyant chaos. Directed by Menahem Golan, this dystopian rock opera is part 1984, part disco fever dream. It tells the story of Bibi and Alfie, two idealistic musicians who are tempted by the mega-corporate music label BIM, a thinly veiled allegory for soulless consumerism and authoritarianism. BIM controls everything, your fashion, your time, even your exercise routine. The film's satirical edge shows how conformity is disguised as freedom and how the music industry manipulates rebellion and youth for profit. Alfie resists while Bibi sells out, and what follows is a wild, glitter-soaked journey into mind control, orgiastic decadence, and spiritual redemption. Though widely mocked for its camp and clunky dialogue, The Apple is a misunderstood monster of counterculture critique. Its absurdity is the point, highlighting how a generation's desire for truth and rebellion gets distorted by the machinery of fame. Its villain, Mr. Boogaloo, is the ultimate record label devil, preaching rebellion while preaching control. And in the end, salvation doesn't come through fame. It comes through rejection of the system. A literal deus ex machina ends the film as a spaceship-like God figure rescues the pure-hearted. It's over-the-top, ridiculous, and unforgettable. The Apple may have bombed on release, but for those who look past the glitter, it's an apocalypse told through a dance beat. Zachariah. Billed as the first electric western, Zachariah fuses acid western vibes with psychedelic rock to create a genre-bending experience like no other. Written in part by members of the Firesign Theater, it follows two friends, Zachariah and Matthew, who roam the Wild West searching for purpose, justice, and themselves. Along the way, they encounter gunfights scored by Country Joe and the Fish and duels performed like surreal concerts. This isn't just a Western, it's a musical quest that mocks violence and masculinity while celebrating spiritual awakening. Bands like the James Gang and Doug Kershaw show up as outlaws, turning shootouts into jam sessions. Zachariah, played by John Rubinstein, begins as a gunslinger, but eventually rejects violence in favor of peace and inner truth. The film critiques not only Hollywood's Western myths, but also the American obsession with dominance and glory. It asks, what if the hero just walks away? What if the journey leads not to bloodshed, but to transcendence? Though niche, Zachariah was embraced by spiritual seekers and counterculture audiences who saw it as a stoned parable for enlightenment. It's the kind of film that defies genre and laughs at structure, perfect for a generation high on consciousness and weary of war. In the end, it doesn't just entertain. It asks you to evolve. Rock and Rule, though released in 1983, Rock and Rule was in production throughout the late 70s and carries the heart of that era's rock rebellion. An animated sci-fi rock opera from Canadian studio Nelvana, the film tells the story of post-apocalyptic humanoid animals where music becomes both salvation and weapon. The villain Mock, modeled after Mick Jagger and David Bowie, tries to summon a demon using the perfect voice. With original songs by Debbie Harry, Lou Reed, Cheap Trick, and Iggy Pop, Rock and Rule drips with counterculture DNA. The hero Omar and the singer Angel must stop Mock's plan and save the world, not with guns, but with harmony, love, and rock. The film celebrates the idea that real power doesn't come from domination, but from self-expression. Beneath its animation is a blistering critique of fame's corrupting influence. Mock, once a musical visionary, is now obsessed with control and spectacle. He steals Angel's voice, hoping to force creativity into conformity. It's a not-so-subtle metaphor for how the industry devours authenticity. Rock and Rule remains one of the most underrated gems of the rock opera era. It's stylish, haunting, and rebellious, a cartoon not for kids, but for those who grew up on the edge of a cultural revolution. When Angel finally sings and defeats the demon, it's not just a climax. It's a cry of creative freedom. Jubilee. Jubilee is what happens when punk rock meets apocalyptic cinema. Directed by Derek Jarman, the film opens with Queen Elizabeth I being transported through time by a magician to witness the collapse of modern Britain. What she sees is a decaying world ruled by anarchy, gangs, and nihilism, a vision eerily prophetic of punk's rise and England's cultural disillusionment. Unlike other rock operas, Jubilee isn't about music as escape, it's about music as destruction. With cameos by punk icons like Adam Ant and music by Brian Eno, the film becomes a noisy, abrasive howl of discontent. There's no hero's journey, only raw chaos. The characters, like Mad, Krabs, and Amyl Nitrate, roam the ruins of British society, committing acts of art, violence, and rebellion. Jarman doesn't moralize, he documents. The film critiques media, monarchy, gender roles, and the commodification of counterculture. It doesn't care if you're uncomfortable, it wants you to be. Jubilee captured the moment punk stopped being music and became a social virus. It told viewers, the revolution isn't coming. It already burned everything down. You either join the fire or get consumed. Grease. Yes, Grease. On the surface, it's all poodle skirts and teenage kicks. But look again. Underneath the retro gloss, Grease is a film about image, rebellion, and identity performance. The 70s audiences who made it a phenomenon weren't just looking backward, they saw themselves reflected in the story of Danny Zuko and Sandy. What makes Grease a stealth counterculture film is its ending. Sandy, the good girl, doesn't reform Danny. Instead, she becomes the leather-clad, cigarette-smoking rebel he has to chase. It flips the script on conformity and identity, suggesting that becoming who you're expected to be may not be freedom at all. The music, Greased Lightning, You're the One That I Want, was pure 50s nostalgia, but the energy was pure 70s rebellion. It's about teenagers creating their own rules, experimenting with who they want to be, and breaking out of post-war idealism. Grease lets girls be bad, boys be soft, and rebels fall in love. It may be wrapped in jukebox charm, but at its core, Grease showed that youth culture isn't about purity. It's about performance, evolution, and power. That final shot, Sandy flying off in a car to the sky, says it all. This wasn't just summer lovin'. It was a liberation disguised in song. These 13 rock operas didn't just entertain, they challenged everything: religion, war, fame, gender, and power. They gave voice to the voiceless and turned rebellion into an art form. If you felt the noise in your bones, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because the revolution still plays in stereo. Let me know if you want this reformatted into a script doc or split into upload sections.